And he went in and took some deep cores and began to analyze those cores for what morphological characteristics might be correlated with yield. And what his group determined was that there is a limiting layer in soils, which may be several different things. It may be an accumulation of clay content over 35%. The thickness of that layer would be about 25 centimeters. Different mineral concretions in the soil, bands of very, very low pH within that rooting zone, structural issues, compacted zones. Several different things can be classified as a restrictive layer. But he found very good positive correlation between the depth to these limiting layers and crop yield.
Welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show, brought to you by Wisenetics. I am Brian Arnell, and I'm coming to you from the campus of Oklahoma State University. Today, excited to have on the show Dr. Steve Phillips. Dr. Phillips is Associate Professor of Soil Fertility at Oklahoma State University. Dr. Phillips has been a colleague and mentor of mine for many years. I first got to know Dr. Phillips when he was at Virginia Tech. And then after Virginia Tech, he went to IPNI, the International Plant Nutrition Institute. Then he did a foray with the African Plant Nutrition Institute in Morocco. And then recently, Oklahoma State brought him back to the States, and he's now the Oklahoma State Soil Fertility Research Specialist. With that, Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm excited to have a chat with you.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, Brian. Glad to be here.
So I did a little quick bio on you. Now, one thing I always like to do with our guest is for the guest to provide a 60-second overview of your path. You know, where did you end? How did you end up at Oklahoma State? And as much as anything, how did you end up in the realm of soil fertility?
Well, so it's an interesting start to my career in soil fertility. I actually was going into weed science was my plan coming out of my undergraduate degree. And I had a friend who was working as the technician here at Oklahoma State in the same project that I'm now running. And the man who became my graduate advisor, Dr. Bill Ron, asked him if he had any friends who were interested in graduate school. And he says, well, I have one, but he's going into weed science. And Bill said, no, he's not. Get him up here. And so I came up for a visit, and sure enough, Dr. Ron converted me. And so I began to focus on a career in fertility, came to OSU for my master's and PhD, and then was fortunate to land a faculty position, as you mentioned, at Virginia Tech right after graduation, doing soil fertility research and extension. Did that for a little over 8 years, and then an opportunity just came out of the blue from the International Plant Nutrition Institute. It was a newly reformed organization from the original Potash and Phosphate Institute. And IPNI offered me an opportunity to really grow my international network, which was something that I'd always been interested in, even from the graduate school days when Bill used to take groups of students down to Summit for a week to work with them. And I really had an interest in international ag. And so I left the university and joined IPNI, ended up spending a dozen years with them until that organization restructured in 2019. And then at that point, one of the offshoots of IPNI was the formation of basically a very similar organization focused on the continent of Africa. And so I accepted a position with them to go run a soil fertility precision ag program all over the continent in Africa, but I was based in Morocco for 4 years. And then for personal reasons, we needed to get back to the U.S. and, through fate and timing, I ended up being able to be right back where I started. And so I joined the faculty here in August of 23. So just coming up on my 2-year anniversary here at the end of the summer.
So just for full transparency to the audience, not only So I said, Dr. Phillips, Steve is a mentor and colleague, and he offered me an opportunity to do my PhD program with him at Virginia Tech, because my advisor for my master's was his advisor, and so we come from the same program. And now he is the research, or I am the extension arm to his research. And so as we get into that, what's some of the stuff you're doing, Steve? Share with some of the group, because I gotta brag that you're doing things and you're doing research that's not necessarily mainstream, and that's a cool thing about jumping in at this point in your career, is that you're able to do some really fun work.
The primary focus of what we're trying to do, both in research and extension here at OSU, is make the best recommendations for the grower that we can. And as you mentioned, you and I have been colleagues for many years. In fact, when you say things like I'm your mentor and I recruited you, you amplify the age difference between us, Brian. So I don't know that you need to do that, but all the years we've worked together, we've always had a similar view on how we can be more precise with our recommendations and provide more value to our growers. And so one of the things that we're working on here at OSU is looking at what are the biological, chemical, and physical drivers that are spatially distributed within a landscape that are affecting fertilizer uptake and utilization by the crop. We've always recognized that nutrient supply varies spatially, and we address this in some of our variable rate fertilizer management strategies. But we've then applied a uniform calibration curve to the fertilizer input to this field, that we recognize variability exists, yield potential varies, nutrient supply varies, but then we aren't dealing with those drivers of responsiveness, whether it be a restrictive layer in the soil, variations in soil texture, biological activity, other nutrient balance issues. So many different things affect the way that fertilizer behaves and cycles once it hits the soil. And so what we're trying to do here is begin to understand those characteristics of the system with more clarity, where we can eventually begin to incorporate those into a recommendation system. Now, what that looks like in terms of the use of technology or soil sensors or imagery or mapping, I don't know the answer to that at this point. But what we're going to try to do here over the next few years is really get an understanding of what drivers we're working with in our different cropping systems in the state, and then begin to identify the tools that exist in our precision ag toolbox that allow us to do a better job for our growers.
So with all the tools and all the variables, as you dive into this concept, where, because you go in a million directions, right? You can go in and you listed off all of the abiotic and biotic stresses or components that can influence plant uptake, plant utilization of nutrients, plant demand for nutrients. Where are you starting? Because you got to have that leaping off point. So where are you starting, and what do you see as future steps?
We're starting with a concept that was first explored by our former soil conservation extension specialist, Dr. Jason Warren. Jason went into a field where he had a history of yield maps from a farm and saw the variation annually and then over the cropping system over a period of years. And he went in and took some deep cores and began to analyze those cores for what morphological characteristics might be correlated with yield. And what his group determined was that there is a limiting layer in soils, which may be several different things. It may be an accumulation of clay content over 35%. The thickness of that layer would be about 25 centimeters. Different mineral concretions in the soil, bands of very, very low pH within that rooting zone, structural issues, compacted zones. Several different things can be classified as a restrictive layer. But he found very good positive correlation between the depth to these limiting layers and crop yield in both soybeans and wheat within the rotation. But his was more of I guess you'd call it out of curiosity, he took these cores. It wasn't really a structured experiment, if you will. And so we're building on that preliminary data because it's there, but we need to better understand what the impact of the different types of restrictive layers are and how they affect different crops differently, because we've got data from one farm that shows that the depth of the layer varies depending on whether it's wheat or soybeans. And so it's the same field, but it affects these two crops differently, whereas we have another field where both crops, both the wheat and the soybeans, are affected in a very similar slope in terms of the yield dependent on the depth to the layer. And so we've designed some new studies here, looking at it in a couple of different ways. One is in a block type experiment, but it's a large scale field where we're working on about 6.5 acres, and we've taken 96 cores. We've got 3 different crop rotations out there, different fertilizer treatments to look at the effect of the layer on responsiveness to both phosphorus and potassium. And so, we've developed a fairly rigorous evaluation there. And then we're also going into our soil fertility extension program is helping us by going into several fields in both wheat and soybeans and taking nearly miles of transects throughout the field, where every 50-foot increment we're taking harvest data and a core surface sample data. And so looking at the same concept in 2 different designs, and I think we're going to converge on hypothetically a pretty clear understanding on what these different restrictive layers are doing to our yield. And then we have to move into, okay, how do we now quantify this and identify it spatially within a landscape?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges with this research is that, and when I speak to other soil scientists, I think or agronomists, I don't think the concept of a restrictive layer driving yield or even the response to nutrient is too out there. But if we start digging down to now, we need to find a mechanism to measure or predict where that layer lies. Now we're starting getting into something that becomes a little more intensive. I've seen some instrumentation out there, some stuff out of Kansas that looks like it might aid it. But do you have any visions on what kind of technologies might be able to be utilized for determining restrictive layer depth?
I really don't, Brian. And that we found ourselves in this situation before where, through partnerships with ag engineers and technology design organization, and that's been one of the things that we've really benefited from here at OSU over the past 3 decades, starting with the Green Seeker technology in the 90s, is that we understand agronomically what we need to know, but the engineers know how to build us the tool to access that information. And so I think just once we understand what it is that we need to be able to identify in a very rapid, cost-effective manner, then we just go back to our engineer partners and have them build us some prototypes and figure this out. I don't know if it's some sort of ultrasound or X-ray or some version of a on-the-go penetrometer. I don't know what the tool is, but once we have the science to support the development of the tool, then I think we're following a reasonable path to a solution.
Well, this is some really exciting stuff, and I'm truly excited about myself. That's why I'm so involved in it. But I want to switch gears a little bit and really switch gears. Oklahoma is a state known for cattle and oil. And you coming into the research program into the soil fertility research program has not let that go by the wayside, at least the cattle side. Share a little bit about what you're doing in the grazing systems.
Yeah, another thing that we're doing in soil fertility is focusing on fertility management within a system. And as you mentioned, one of the biggest systems in Oklahoma is a crop livestock system, whether that be dual purpose wheat, whether it be improved pastures for hay or grazing. But we can do quite a bit of fertility work focused on these livestock systems in Oklahoma, in terms of forage management, forage fertility in these different systems, warm season, cool season, perennial pastures versus annual cereals. A lot of different things we're doing. And we've always tended to, at least in Oklahoma, we've looked at animal performance on different forages, and we've looked at the performance of fertility practices on different forages. But what are we doing in terms of the fertility practice effect on the animal performance? And so we've started some trials here where we're actually using animals as the performance indicator for our fertility treatments. I'll give you a specific example. We've got a project looking at some different Bermuda grass pasture management strategies. One would be just graze out and then feed hay during the winter. The other would be stockpiling Bermuda grass, where we would remove the animals in the late summer, early fall, and allow that to grow and basically perform a hay in place system that we can turn the cattle back out onto after the frost. And then we're looking at some cereal interseeding into the established Bermuda grass pastures. Now, none of this is new. I mean, we have guidelines for this, but looking at it in terms of the animal performance, I mean, what sort of stocking rates can we put out on this? How do the animals respond in terms of overall body condition score and weight maintenance on these different systems? How deeply into the winter can we extend that grazing window before we have to begin to feed hay? And so we're establishing these treatments and using the OSU herd down at our research station in southeast Oklahoma. And we go down every 2 weeks and we look at the forage growth, the forage consumed. We look at the change in animal weight. And these are heavy bred cows. These are 7-month bred cows. And so we're looking more to maintain the overall health of that animal. We take manure samples every week to look at the cycling of our different nitrogen treatments, whether it's being properly metabolized by the animal, or if we're just making a protein-rich forage that's not actually resulting in any value. So we're looking at that both economically and from a nutrient use efficiency standpoint. We hope to do similar things, in different systems coming here into the next couple of years, looking a little more at our dual-purpose systems, maybe looking at some options for a mid-season decision to graze out as opposed to go to grain. How do we manage the forage crop from there to add the greatest value to those spring calves that we want to put out on these systems? We're working with the Natural Resource and Ecology Management Group. You've started some work, I know, that we're also interested in looking at from a research side on some pasture renovation strategies, looking at both fertility and animal management on these systems to try to recover some of the productivity we're seeing decline in some of our native grasslands here in the state. But I think it's an area that we're real excited about. Cattle. I mean, we like this connection of the animal and the cropping systems, looking at it more holistically, for our growers, rather than just giving them guidelines for their wheat and guidelines for their cattle. Let's look holistically at how growers are incorporating animals into these agronomic production systems and work to add the most value we can on both sides of that coin.
Kind of want to dive a little bit further into the science of what's going on and even the challenges. Can you Because it's one thing to look at a two-way interaction or a one or two-way interaction in a replicated trial where you're maintaining all variables. You're taking fertility to a different level. You're not just adding one or two variables. You're adding all the variables when you start throwing cattle in the mix across rangeland. Can you talk a little bit about the differences and maybe the challenges of trying to do this in a true scientific form, but doing it holistically, because it's not just cut and dry.
Yeah, and this is what you're describing is a standalone philosophy that's been developing over the past 10, 12 years, and we call it on-farm experimentation. And it's really a paradigm shift in the way we look at our ability to take research to the grower. Because, there's been articles written over the years by socioeconomists and behavioral scientists looking at theories of change and how growers respond to, let's say, university research data, for example, done a small plot trial, done on an experiment station. Inevitably, we hear, yeah, well, but that's not really on the farm, because it is a more controlled environment, and you do tend to isolate the variable of interest, and we do that, for statistical validation of our design and our results. But in the real world, it's not a controlled environment. There are other factors in play. And as researchers, there's been several, and continue to be several, that will avoid that situation because it's a lot harder to show differences. It's harder to prove your hypothesis. But if we're asking the right questions, and we're asking these questions are being generated in a farmer-centric environment, where we're working more of a grassroots rather than a top-down, whether we go into a system as scientists and ask a bunch of questions and come up with a hypothesis or a solution. We run the trial, and then we take the results back to the grower and say, here's the answer. The rate of adoption there is going to be much lower than if we go in to an operation and sit down with the farmer or the rancher and say, all right, what are your challenges? What are your management objectives? And then go through a more of a partnership with that grower, then use our scientific expertise to figure out how to design these trials that'll have more real world applicability to the grower, but still the scientific rigor that we need as scientists to have confidence that the results are repeatable. And so we're taking that approach in soil fertility, that we're looking more at what kind of response can we get in a real world situation that's repeatable for these growers, that these growers are invested in from the concept to the testing to the outcome. And then I think that's how we see real change in Oklahoma systems, is involve those growers from the beginning, work as closely to real world situations as we can, and then deliver the results in the manner that the grower has asked for them from the very beginning.
So if we look into the first year of work that you've been working on this system, have you had a chance to get any of the data in and see anything that's kind of piqued your interest?
Well, the only thing that piques my interest is that, well, it's hard to say, Brian, because this year the rainfall was, again, the real world situation is that, we're very dependent on rainfall for these forage production systems. These are rain-fed environments. And so we placed this trial in the area of the state where we felt like we had the most consistent, most uniform rainfall, and the water shut off this year. And so I'd be hesitant to really go into too much of what we're seeing, because, again, I'm not sure that this is representative of the true response of these systems. But, even given the temporal challenges we faced. On the livestock side, we were very happy. We were able to maintain weight. We were able to extend our grazing season. We were able to save on our hay input costs, and we didn't see any effect on birth weight. We were able to turn the calves back out onto our cereal interseeded plots, and so we got a little extra value into those in the spring once the calves were weaned. And so, we're seeing some positives, but in terms of any scientific response, I really can't say at this point.
It's time for our famous three.
Wisenetics turns podcast airtime into brand authority. We don't sell ads, we elevate voices. Curious how far your voice can go to become a reference in the industry and attract more leads? Scan the QR code and discover how we can turn your expertise into unmatched brand authority. Let's transform expertise into influence, starting now.
Well, Steve, I've really enjoyed it, but we're hitting that timeline. We're going to wrap up with 3 questions that all of our guests always get. And the first one's going to jump into, over your career, what's been a go-to work resource for you? Where do you go when you have questions?
Now, my colleagues, networking and relationships, my entire career, the foundation of anything I've ever done that's been viewed as successful by any constituent has been a team effort. And so I'd say the network that I've been able to build and continue to build in my career is my foundation, and my net and my go-to is my network.
Fantastic. Now, I know you're rock and rolling, got a ton of stuff going, but what do you do in your free time? What's your favorite leisurely activity?
Sports. I like to play golf. I like to hike and bike out in the woods. We've got a wonderful little set of trails out of the lake here that's less than 10 minutes from my house. And so I'm more of an outdoor sports kind of guy.
Finally, where do people go to find out more about your research program?
More about my research program. Well, my research is communicated through the OSU Soil Fertility Extension. And so I would say once I do anything worth talking about here, and as you mentioned, I'm just getting started here, Brian, but as I do, we will disseminate actually through your podcast, your NPK blog, your social media. We'll partner. We'll take advantage of this research extension partnership that we have, and I'll do the work and let you tell people about it.
I like that answer. Well, folks, that wraps up another episode of the Crop Science Podcast Show presented by Wisenetics. Thanks for joining us today with our guest, Dr. Steve Phillips. He is the Associate Professor of Soil Fertility Research and Teaching at Oklahoma State University. Remember, if you enjoyed this podcast, subscribe to that channel so you get notifications every time we drop a new one. Also, share with this video with friends and colleagues. And make sure you leave us a comment if you have suggestions for new guests or questions for old guests. With that, Steve, always enjoy the conversations. Look forward to it again.
Appreciate it, Brian. Thank you very much.